We have the policy on the disruption of meetings. Step 1. We would identify disruptive persons and request that they desist. Step 2, we would inform obstructors of the existence of our policy and the university's intent to protect free speech. Step 3, if the disruption continues, those responsible should be asked to leave. Step 4, if the disruption still continues, we'll recess the event and consider options to reconvene in an alternate space. Step 5, we'll take measures to ensure the event can be reconvened without obstruction. And step 6, if the interim measures are not sufficient, we'll consider the assistance of the external authorities. So, good evening. I'm Denise Fong, leader of the UT Men's Issues Awareness Society and your panel moderator tonight. Earlier this month, the Washington Post described Madeleine Albright, the first ever female U.S. Secretary of State, as the embodiment of female ability, know-how, and grit. Madeleine Albright would be a prominent voice of support for Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. And this month, the former U.S. Secretary of State's way of encouraging female potential voters to vote for Hillary was to tell them that if they didn't do so as women supporting women, then, quote, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. You might know that this backfired heavily among intended women voters, and later in the month, Hillary went on to lose the primary election to Bernie Sanders in the state of New Hampshire. I don't know if that was a factor, but she'll probably be the next US president. That's my projection. The notion of women stick together, helping women because they are women, and rallying the idea of girls first isn't resonating with the public like it once did. From the same camp, the mentality of a broad victimhood or calling for all the heads of the accused, fist pumping when they've been cut off, and then allowing a frenzied media to blindly condemn individuals like Jian Ghomeshi, as we've seen for months now in our city. It doesn't resonate. I don't know if he's innocent, and I don't care that much about that. But what I care about is the hijacking of our justice process by your average citizen and by law enforcement as a means to attack someone rather than to defend or to get the truth. It seems to me that so much of what is resonating with me today as a woman, and with many of the women I've known through the Canadian Association for Equality, which is our event sponsor tonight, what's resonating with me is not talked about anywhere. Men's issues aren't talked about in public, in government, or at schools. Here, once a month, we're doing it at the UTMIAS, but where else in Canada's largest city is there a regular intellectual discussion on men's issues? I admit it's a bit discouraging when, in exploring the established social services infrastructure in Toronto on behalf of our group, that I'm told very clearly through it that all my male loved ones, my brothers, husband, and father, that they matter less, if at all. I admit I still find it bizarre to be seen as this politically incorrect, and how week after week, posters for our event are torn down the instant that they're stapled up across the UT. Not that we were expecting any special consideration for our posters as an all-women panel this time. Introducing the first ever panel event of women supporting men talking about women supporting men. She for he is a road that's much less traveled, but deeply compelled by a sense of responsibility for what happens to all of us and those we care about. When terms like patriarchy, rape culture, the wage gap, terms originated primarily by women, when terms like these aren't looked at critically or are just otherwise repeated or believed today, a good question for female members of the audience is, how do you feel about it as a woman? What do you think about these terms? We welcome your thoughts tonight. To conclude, I would say that, in truth, the former U.S. Secretary of State's earlier statement this month was quite right. As women opting out of the Women Must Vote for Women group, we find ourselves indeed living in that special place in hell that she describes of us. Because when it's 20 times the workplace fatalities today, and more than half of all domestic abuse victims dismissed by society, dismissed by police, dismissed like the male majority of those homeless, suicidal, or wrongfully accused. Yet in Canada, until the founding of the new Canadian Centre for Men and Families, have zero dedicated social support services, men in Canada today are plainly disposed of, or put away. Put away from us, put away from themselves, their future, and all too often put away from their own children. Whether you're a man or a woman, this is really all our hell. And tonight, for the first time, you'll have the opportunity to see how we stand in this special place in hell, speaking as women of the men's movement. Thanks for joining us tonight. Please welcome our panelists. So I'm going to first introduce our panelists, who will then talk briefly about their role at CAFE, or the Center for Men and Families, as women supporting men's issues, after which we'll proceed with some preliminary questions to get the conversation going. From time to time, I'll turn to you in the audience to offer some follow-up questions. We'll take a break at about half past 8 for 5 minutes, and then return with the second part of our session. Please follow us on Twitter tonight at Equality Canada with the hashtag Men's Issues. During the break or after tonight's session, please sign the clipboard for news and event updates from us at the UT Men's Issues Society. Here are our guest panelists. So from your very left, let's pull up my document. We have Yola Masani. Yola is a researcher for the Canadian Association for Equality and a recent public policy master's graduate of the University of Toronto. Yola contributes research briefs on men's issues and writes regularly for CAFE's blog. She was previously a volunteer at MSD International, Women's College Hospital, and War Child Canada. Yola joined CAFE because she strongly believes that gender equality means that men who are victims of violence and discrimination by our laws and policies should be acknowledged, and that their concerns should be addressed appropriately by help centers and laws alike. Welcome, Yola. And next to her we have Karen Glenn. Karen is a professional fundraiser and a chartered professional accountant. She currently serves as the fundraising lead for the Canadian Centre for Men and Families in Toronto, and with nearly 15 years of business experience in the for-profit corporate sector, Karen has also worked on fundraising initiatives for various charitable organizations, both in Canada and in the US. Karen's interest in men's issues comes from the very personal place of bearing witness to the struggles of a number of men in her life. In addition to her work with the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, Karen fundraises for an organization that seeks to empower women and girls in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in their right to access reproductive health services. Welcome, Karen. And next we have Ellen Campbell, a survivor of childhood sexual abuse with a long road to healing. Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness CEO and founder Ellen Campbell translated her own recovery into hope for others. In 1993, she organized the first national conference for adult survivors of sexual abuse. The Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness is a national charitable organization that has served Canadians since then. Its mandate is to significantly reduce the incidence and impact of abuse through education and public awareness. They are a national leader in the development of programs to prevent abuse and advocating for the rights of those who have been abused. In 1998, a program was established to address sex scandal at the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, and it's still managed to this day by the Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness. Over 130 organizations, including the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, are supported nationally by the Centre, including Children's Services, Victim Services, shelters, and other agencies for both men and women. As CEO and founder of the Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness, the name Ellen Campbell has become synonymous with abuse prevention and recovery in Canada. The CCAA is a member also of the Association of Missing and Exploited Children and the Ontario Public School Board's Association's Violence in the Media Coalition through Ms. Campbell's participation. Welcome to the panel, Ellen Campbell. So we have Heidi next. Heidi Maynard is the co-founder and director of Fathers Resources International and has been an activist for over 3 decades, focused on the rights of children to maintain an ongoing parenting relationship with their father after a separation or divorce. She has co-hosted Toronto's longest-running free support group for fathers facing separation and divorce, along with her husband, Danny Gusby, who lost his battle with cancer 14 months ago. She continues to host the support group as well as offer all of the Fathers Resources International services, including a comprehensive library of divorce education, audios, and material, and divorce coaching specifically designed for fathers. In addition, she continues to help with family court self-representation and full representation assistance alongside the family lawyers she works with. As an international activist for divorce reform, she has presented to committees of all levels of government, as well as over 60 hours of live national television appearances and radio interviews. Her print interviews include those with the National Post, the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, the Ottawa Citizen, and many international publications. Heidi is a child of a divorce survivor. At age 5, she no longer had a relationship with her father and grew up without benefiting from the parenting she should have been entitled to receive from him. She believes in shared parenting and that it's a child's right to benefit from both parents as a family breaks up. And we have Theron. Theron Mayer is joining us from Vancouver. Should be on the screen right now, but I also have to use my laptop. Okay, so maybe you'll see her in just a moment, but I'm going to read her bio at the same time. So I'll read there. I'm going to read your. I'm going to introduce you first, and then we'll be able to see you. I'm sorry about this because of the technology that we have right now is just on my laptop. So you'll see her in just a moment. But I'm going to introduce Theron now. Theron Mayer is the president of the Advocacy for Men and Boys Club at Simon Fraser University and a leader in the students' movement for men's human rights. She has been interviewed by and featured in major news articles and news outlets such as the Daily Extra, the Huffington Post, Canada, and the Globe and Mail. As a trans woman, Theron provides valuable insights into the world of gender politics on her rapidly growing YouTube channel under her name and with the unassailable reason and logic that she employs to impart these insights to the world. In other words, she doesn't stop brawling until there isn't a single gender ideologue left standing. Welcome, Theron. And now we'll get to see her. Theron. Hello. I'm mute. Can you see everybody? I'm just gonna.
See everyone. Can I see?
I'm gonna turn the just so you can see the audience so far, and then our panel. Oh, everything's backwards. Oh, there's our panel. Hi. Okay. So, should we leave it on the panel, or do you want to see the audience? What should we do? Maybe we should leave it on the panel.
I think panel's good.
Okay, thank you. Great. Can you help me? I want to have the sound.
It should be coming through. I don't know why it isn't. It should be coming through here.
Maybe we can push this in. Okay, Theron, can you say hello? You're very quiet. Can we make her louder?
Can you guys hear me?
Okay. Can you say something again so we can know we can hear you for sure?
Hello.
Good? Great. Okay, so the audience has confirmed that they can hear you, which is our goal. And now I'm just going to move over to the panel so I can start moderating and asking. Actually, we'll start with the initial remarks because that will lead us into the discussion tonight. So we'll go from left to right, if that's okay. We'll start with Yola. Okay. So we'll have Yola's remarks.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, of course. And good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. So, as Denise mentioned, I started working with the Canadian Association for Equality last November and have been primarily researching and writing research briefs on men's issues. Although my time researching is a little bit limited, so I'm not definitely an expert on these issues, I have some information just diving into the information a bit, I'd like to just speak to my motivation for being a part of the She for He campaign and for being a part of the Canadian Association for Equality. For me, gender equality should not be a war. It's not a war. It's not us versus them. It's all of us together. And I think that stems from the fact that when I think of men, I don't think of men as my enemies. I think of them as my brother, my father, my husband, and those are the people that you share most of your life with. And I mean, if you don't care for them, then I can't even understand why you would try to see them as enemies. In addition to that, I also believe that gender equality, in order for it to be a successful movement and an accomplishment of both parts, we need to understand that we need fair outcomes for both men and women. So this does not mean men climbing on women to succeed or women climbing on men to succeed, but rather the issues of both vulnerable men and women need to be addressed. So men are victims and have encountered and can encounter situations which render them vulnerable. And they are deserving of help, and they are deserving of help centers and resources to help them move past these moments in their lives. Touching back on my first research brief, the main points that I would like to zone into is that negative and flawed images of men are perpetuated by most genre of popular culture, and this means books, television, movies, greeting cards, comic strips, ads, commercials, and more. And as we all know, media discourses are powerful and they do shape the perspectives of societal attitudes. And if the media tends to minimize and demonize the men in our lives, then really what we're doing is that we're laughing at victims who are men. We are laughing at male victims who have gone through physical abuse, who have encountered sexual abuse, verbal abuse, emotional trauma. And we are encouraging this behavior and also leading male victims to believe that they deserved what they encountered. Demonizing men and reinforcing these harmful stereotypes about males and masculinity and male victimization leads to negative consequences, not just for men, but also for women and for gender relations alike. My second project looks at misandrous policies and laws, which is a very broad area, and I would just try to touch specifically on the criminal justice system and the civil court system. That is what I'm looking at right now. And I'm looking at issues such as sentencing rates and bias against fathers in the courts, male victims of sexual assault, and more, and just trying to understand the way that they are treated in comparison to women. So obviously gender inequality exists, and certainly men do play the role of the oppressor or the offender at times. However, casting an entire gender in this light is damaging to society. And the resounding sentiment emerging from academic statistics and community reports is that men are unfairly treated procedurally by police, courts, and correctional services. Our criminal justice system and our family courts have been permeated by incorrect myths regarding the nature of men and have resulted in unfair results in sentencing rates between male and female offenders, as well as for fathers seeking custody for their children or fathers contributing to child support, men fighting as victims in domestic violence cases, men fighting as victims of sexual assault, and so much more. Recently, an assistant law professor at the University of Michigan, Sonia Starr, found that men are given much higher sentences than women convicted for the same crime in federal court. The 2012 study, very recent, called Estimating Gender Disparities in Federal Criminal Cases, found what has been actually repeatedly seen in academics before, that men receive sentences that are 63% higher on average than their female counterparts. It also found that females arrested for a crime are significantly less likely to avoid charges and convictions entirely, and twice as likely to avoid incarceration if convicted of the crime. This, for me, was a bit shocking when I came across this fact, and what I needed to know immediately was why. Why is this happening? And of course, there has been theoretical research to address this question, and a lot of it leads back to these harmful stereotypes that I was speaking to earlier. There are two main theories that address this question: the chivalry thesis, which dates back to the 1970s, and the theory that looks at judicial decision-making. I'll start with the chivalry thesis, and what it actually says is that it's premised on cultural stereotypes about gender and asserts that gendered stereotypes about men and women both influence sentencing outcomes according to the sex of the offender. Women are deemed in need of protection and not fully responsible for their actions. When these stereotypes play out in the criminal justice system, they will result in preferential treatment for female offenders from predominantly male police officers, prosecutors, and judges. The theory based on judicial decision-making proposes that the relationship between gender and sentencing is the byproduct of human error expressed in judicial outcomes. And what this means is that, what it's really saying is that judges, because they are limited in the amount of time that they can spend on individual cases, they tend to receive incomplete information with regards to the case and the defendant's case. So with this time constraint means that the judge and other court players make these contextual attributions about the defendant's culpability and character, and they base this on three focal points: blameworthiness, dangerousness, and practical constraints. So while they may attribute certain risks to one gender more than the other, this will definitely lead in some kind of preferential treatment being shown based on gender. Females have tended to be viewed as less of a risk, and males have been seen as more culpable or more likely to be dangerous and have received higher sentences, as mentioned before. So what I have learned and what I wanted to share today was that these gender stereotypes, which are so far, entrenched in our society, in our media, the way we see each other, are having this horrible negative effect on the men that we love when they encounter the civil court systems, when they encounter the system as a father, when they encounter the system as a victim of sexual abuse. And to me, that is unforgivable. And I can't imagine not being a part of this movement or trying to do my best to correct this gender disparity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next we have Karen Glenn.
Hi, good evening everyone. As Denise mentioned, I'm the fundraising lead at the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. And I'll be really honest, my very first encounter with men's issues occurred not that long ago when I was driving home from work one day down DuPont Street. I was stopped at a traffic light and I saw this billboard that said, "Half of domestic violence victims are male. No domestic abuse shelters are dedicated to us." And there was an image of an enraged woman in the middle of assaulting a cowering man. So I looked at this billboard and I completely bought into the idea that men are victims of domestic violence. But I completely disbelieved the claim that they were half of victims. Completely disbelieved it. So when I got home, I dug into Statistics Canada's General Social Survey data. And I was totally shocked to find that statistic was corroborated. In that moment, my framework for understanding domestic violence, that is, my understanding of it as a women's issue, changed irrevocably. And I realized if I didn't know about this, there were probably a lot of other women who also didn't know about this. Several months later, I started volunteering at the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. And as I was exposed to more of the issues that we see at the center, I discovered more distressing facts. So in addition to experiencing domestic violence in roughly the same proportion as women, men are twice as likely to abuse drugs or alcohol. They're 3 to 4 times more likely to die from suicide and women. And undiagnosed anxiety and depression are prevalent among men. What makes these trends even more concerning is a fourth fact, which is the fact that men are dramatically less likely to seek help for mental health concerns than women. One reason must obviously be that men are socialized to man up, to sort of suffer in silence, and to really suppress any signs of helplessness. And I don't have to look much farther than my own circle of family and friends to see evidence of this culture of silence. And I'm sure a lot of the same stories can be found among many of the people who are here in the room this evening. I know several men who have chosen to take their own lives.
So I'm just going to put this here. So
These men didn't say goodbye to those of us who were closest to them. And while we were aware that they'd been facing struggles, none of us had any idea that such an extreme course of action had become an option for them. I also can't approach these issues without talking about my father, who was brutally abused as a child and then went on to be abused by his first wife, who I need to stipulate was not my mother. The first half of his life was deeply traumatizing and surrounded by alcoholism, and as a result, he suffered extreme anxiety throughout his adult life. Hypervigilance, he had difficulty regulating and expressing his emotions. And when I asked him about, have you considered seeking therapeutic counseling, his response was, and I quote, "What kind of a man pours out his problems to a complete stranger?" Unfortunately, he died having never dealt with these traumas. And I tried to understand my father through a lot of different lenses, through our cultural lens, through biological lens, through our economic background. But it wasn't until I really started to look at his experience through the lens of gender, that is the norms of masculinity that forbid vulnerability, that I really started to understand my dad and in many ways myself. So these experiences have taught me that men's issues aren't just for men. Gender norms that teach men that, asking for help is weakness, that they need to suffer in silence, that they need to man up in the face of difficulties, these hurt women too. Breaking down these gender norms so that men feel comfortable getting help literally keeps them alive and with us longer, helps them become more self-aware and resilient partners, fathers, brothers, and sons. Thank you.
thank you, Karen. That was very touching. Ellen.
Well, I really became aware of the issue of men not being seen as victims probably about 22 years ago. I owned a recovery bookstore in Toronto called That Other Bookstore. And I did the first national conference, as was stated, for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And at the time I was asked to do it with a group of women. And when they found out that I also wanted men to come to the conference, they pulled out. Because I said, I'm not doing it unless men are involved, because as has been spoken, and we all know, men are not just perpetrators, they can be, but they're also victims. And so I did that conference 3 years in a row. And that first year I had about 300 people come from right across Canada, but there was only a handful of men, just a really couple men. And the next year, a few more, and the third year, a few more. Well, many of you maybe are too young to remember, but about 14 years ago, Martin Cruz was the first man to come forward at Maple Leaf Gardens to say he'd been sexually abused by Gordon Stuckless. And as a result, Martin Cruz came forward. Martin had come forward, and Gordon Stuckless got 2 years less a day for abusing. Well, I've had over 100 men approach me so far that were victims of either Stuckless or Roby. So Martin felt, is this all my life is worth? And of course, he was very troubled by and in trauma, took his own life. He jumped from the Bloor Viaduct. And so Stuckless got went back to court. He got federal time, but then he got out in 2/3. And of course, you're hearing about Stuckless all the time, still in the news, new victims all the time. But what that did was, because Martin came forward and Sheldon Kennedy has come forward, and more recently Theo Fleury, men are more comfortable now to come forward. And that's the good news. The bad news is there's very little for them to come forward to. We're a referral resource center, and I would say the majority of calls that I get are from men. And we have done 26 conferences on male victimization. And again, the good news is, at each conference we've done, for instance, the one here in Toronto, we've done them with the OPP and Lynn McDonnell, the therapist we work with. And the one in Toronto, I think we had 400 people come. Now, it wasn't all victims. It was the first line people, the police, the therapists, the families. That's great, but again, there's so little for men available. And then last year, I heard about Center for Men and Families. Did I say it right?
Center for Men and Families.
Yes, okay. And I heard about Justin, what he was doing, and I phoned him. I said, I think this is amazing. Not just that it's for men, but it's for families. Because, you know, it's like anyone. When there's someone in the family that is struggling, the whole family is struggling. So I really liked it, and I said, you know, people have to find out about you. This is amazing. So we did a conference last fall, which was wonderful. So I'm really happy that more and more men are coming forward. But again, when they call me, most of them don't have money. A lot of them maybe are dealing with addictions. Do you know over 95% of the men in prison have been sexually abused? Over 85% of the women in prison have been sexually abused. So I think I'm really frustrated when I do get the calls. And more recently, I'm hearing more and more about domestic abuse. And actually, a lot of it I'm learning more and more from the center. But I did have a man come to my office about a year ago, and he was crying because his wife was hitting him, spitting on him, kicking him in front of the children. But what's he going to do? If he leaves, he can't leave with the children. There's nowhere he can go. And if he leaves by himself, the children and the dog are going to get it. So he's trapped. And there's so many men in that situation. And I was appointed to the Advisory Committee for Judicial Appointments by the Attorney General a couple of years ago. And I found out how judges are picked. And it's definitely political. But also, there's a quota now for women judges, that they want women judges, minorities. I mean, there's a quota. That may help. I'm hoping that with more women judges appointed, there might be more sensitivity than the men judges. Unfortunately, you can't teach judges anything. If you invited them to a course, they wouldn't come. So we've tried. I've worked a lot with the government, the federal government specifically, on changing the laws to protect children. We were very instrumental. It was our legislation that brought the age of consent from 14 to 16. But that took 3 years. So this is going to take a while. It's changing a whole culture. But I think it's wonderful that women are now getting behind this. There's still there's an element of women that are extreme, that don't want to, that we are called extremists ourselves. But I think more and more people are understanding this. But I just want to congratulate you, Justin, for your center. And I'm very, very proud to be a part of it and support you. One other thing I should. It is.
You're all
But
part of that team.
yeah, exactly, and my female friends up here too, that are going to hell. But I'm an ordained minister, so I don't know how that's going to work. The other thing I just want to mention too is we support over 100 agencies a year. I would say about 85% of them are shelters, women coming out of shelters, and we can provide them with everything from bedding, brand new bedding, to housewares. We can really get them set up. But we are able to do that for men as well. That I want to put it out there. I don't know who here are frontline workers, but if you have some man that is starting over again, we will help him with everything, from furniture, we can help clothing. We just gave a whole bunch of clothing to Justin. So I just want to put that out there. And then one other thing I want to mention is that really helped is 11 years ago, John Derringer from Q107 came on board. And he does the 13 Days of Christmas for us, for 13 days. He's a huge supporter of men. And he is always, when I have anything about men, like I'll tell him about tonight, he'll talk about it on air. So I think you can get a few media people really, speaking about it. Someone that he's a man's man. He's a real jock. And actually the reason he even got involved was he got charged, he and the station were sued because he named a judge, a tool of the day, which he has every day, a tool of the day, for giving a pedophile a conditional sentence, which means house arrest. And he named the judge, and of course you can't name a judge on air, and he got sued. But he is very, very passionate about this issue. So if you don't listen to Q107, it's just a little plug there to John Derringer in the morning. Okay.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thanks.
Next we have Heidi Niebert.
Welcome, everybody. I left my notes in my computer in a different location, so this is going to be off the cuff. First of all, I'm so pleased to be sitting next to these amazing women. And just full disclosure, I'm also a survivor of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, so I totally relate from where you're coming from. And oddly enough, when I researched that way back when, found that 1 in 7 girls and 1 in 4 boys are sexually abused. And again, we're not addressing those 1 in 4 boys, and they don't have a voice. And I think it's abhorrent that these individuals that perpetrate that kind of abuse on children get a 2-year sentence when the child has a life sentence. So it's just my speech on that one issue. To get on to what I do and what Fathers Resources International has been doing for 24 years, it all started with my husband, who unfortunately passed away 14 months ago, who was a stay-at-home dad when I met him, and I could not believe the amount of, or the lack of services for him, and the struggles that he had as a stay-at-home dad. He eventually embraced this whole issue, and we jointly launched Fathers Resources, and he began offering services. He became a certified law clerk, and between the two of us, we produced a whole series of education programs specifically for fathers. So the main issue really comes down to the family courts, and again, this is strictly my opinion, are stuck in the 1950s when moms are home baking and waiting for their husbands to arrive, who is the main breadwinner. That's not today. That hasn't been today for 30, 40 years. You look at most households today, if you find a stay-at-home mom, it's a surprise. Oddly enough, there are more stay-at-home dads today because they've unfortunately ended up out of the workforce. That aside, if the whole purpose behind feminism and women's rights came down to my right to drive a dump truck or work on the electrical line or work in a nuclear plant, those typical, or engineering, those typical male jobs, what's wrong with a man staying at home changing diapers and taking care of a child? That, in my opinion, is equality. And yet, I have seen and met with so many stay-at-home dads, and as soon as their marriage falls apart, the women who are the breadwinners get the children, and the children are taken care of by a nanny, which is beyond my comprehension. Why is that? The family courts do not see that the children deserve and need to have both parents in their lives as much as possible. As much as I say I believe in shared parenting, That doesn't necessarily mean 50-50 timeshare. It's whatever you can conjure up as being possible. The more time you spend with your child, the more they learn from you, the more interaction, the more solid foundation that child has. I grew up without my father. I had no self-esteem. I thought love was associated with sex because I was sexually abused as a child. And had my father been in my life, that sexual abuse probably would have stopped a lot sooner, and I would have believed that I was beautiful. My mother didn't give me that because that's not her job. That's not her role. Every man I've ever met who has a daughter thinks she's the most beautiful child. There's no argument there. I could see you smiling. All that aside, I want to share something, and it's something that really kind of shocked me. I was moving from one office to another, basically from Pape and Danforth down to Chester and Danforth, and the parking permit that I had didn't work at that location. So I had to park right on Logan, if anybody knows Greektown, and I ended up parking right in front of a school. And every morning I had to go down. I was able to go down then and move the car. So I'd be down there at 8:30 in the morning in front of this elementary school, and to my surprise, the large majority, and I mean large majority, 70 to 80% of the parents that were walking their children to school were male. Totally shocking to me. I don't know if these guys were out of work, if they were stay-at-home dads, if they worked from home, or they were able to arrange flex time with their position at work, or how they conducted their business. But wow, unbelievable, wonderful. And yet when you end up in front of a family court judge, you are a nothing. You are only a revenue stream. Because child support is more important than anything else. And I'm not here to say child support's not important. We have to both parents have to financially support our children, but we equally have to support their emotional well-being. Because if they're emotionally unstable, it doesn't matter how many iPads or iPhones or other toys those kids get from all that financial stuff, they're still going to be a mess. So next time you have an opportunity to call your MP and your MPP and the Attorney General, tell them there's a problem in family court. This will not change unless people let those officials out there know that there's a problem. Because guess what? Your silence is also a message. And the message is, it's all working fine. And we all know it's not. And as these women have pointed out, men typically do not speak up. Why? Because you're supposed to man up. You're not supposed to have problems. You're supposed to be together. You can't have any emotions. The bottom line is we're both human beings, regardless of our gender. And it's important that our courts be brought up to the speed of the fact that it's 2016, not 1950. That's all I have to say.
It's you next.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, I'm just going to start. I don't trust this technology for 1 second, so I hope everything goes okay. I'm also in the school right now in the music department because ironically the music department is the quietest place in my school. So yeah, thank you so much, Justin and Denise, for inviting me to come speak. I don't have anything written up that's like really formal. I thought I'd just talk about like how I got involved in student activism and why I'm interested in men's issues and men's human rights. So about like a year back, like in the beginning of 2015, I was very involved on campus with like trans-related activism, and I was very kind of involved in the social justice community on the campus. And it's there where I started kind of noticing the kind of anti-man bias and the harmful assumptions about men and their experiences, and how pervasive they were within the on-campus social justice circles. And they really went unquestioned. And then when I decided to kind of challenge and criticize these sentiments, I was vilified for it, and I was, called a misogynist and an anti-feminist and a bunch of other names, which now is, I wear it with the badge of honor. It is then that I decided to kind of apostatize myself from these groups and started to begin the first steps of forming a men's issues club. And in kind of July, in the summer of last year is when I and a friend of mine started the ACP Advocacy for Men and Boys Club with the help of Cafe. And of all the stories I hear of such clubs trying to form, men's issues clubs trying to form, we had a relatively easy time, and I say relatively because it still was definitely more difficult than the average club to gain, official club status. When Denise invited me to come speak about, come speak at this event, and I heard it was called She for He, I obviously thought of what it was referencing, the He for She campaign. And it made me think back on when I was watching Emma Watson's speech about the He for She campaign, and how she kind of paid lip service to men's issues, very kind of superficially, but there seemed to be a promise that if men join kind of the feminist movement or the women's movement to address women's issues, they will kind of be rewarded by having their issues looked at as well. And then I dug a bit deeper and found that these were mostly empty promises, and that there were no frameworks set up to actually address men's issues in this He for She. And it was just it was the age-old story of men helping women and men setting aside their issues, no matter how important and how pressing, for the sake of the greater good, and the greater good being women. So that really encapsulates my experience of how often men's issues are paid lip service, but then they're kind of put on the back burner, and then nothing really happens. And that really resembles my experience of the sentiments on campus. We'll eventually get to it, and then eventually, we never really end up getting to it. So the reason I decided to dedicate my work to men's issues and men's human rights is not because I care more about men. I care about men just as much, which I think is rare in today's society. When people may claim they care about men just as much as they care about women and trans people, but I think when it comes down to where resources go and what issues are paid attention to, I just don't think that most people do. So that's why that's why I decided to dedicate my work on men's issues, because as a woman, as a trans woman, my voice is so crucial in this, and I find I don't mind being a tool for the men's movement, even though I know very well I won't be used as a utility. I don't mind being part of the toolkit with which we have to break through this cultural barrier when it comes to address the men's issues. Having that said, when we were kind of communicating about what my opening remarks should include a few controversial assertions. And I am maybe to beg frog, because I don't mind running my mouth. But I like talking about the issue of trans misogyny. I fairly recently started looking at the idea of trans misogyny through the lens of men's issues and men's rights. And I realized that what trans misogyny really boils down to is misandry. Because when I'm, like, every time I've ever experienced transphobia and experienced violence or harassment or abuse for being trans, it was not because I was perceived as a woman, it's because I was perceived by the perpetrator as a broken man. That really made me understand that as trans women, we kind of tread a line between having female privilege of being taken care of and having our lives valued as women, and having kind of a social support network. Like for example, the other day I was in a dodgy area of town, and there was a guy who was mentally ill, and he was making very weird statements towards me. And right away there was a guy who came to my aid to protect me. If I were a man, I would never receive that. So ultimately, we kind of tread a very thin line between having female privilege and having me, the female, or male privilege, and kind of being deemed to be
I think she's frozen. I think she's stuck.
lady, you really have to be deemed as less than human. You have to be deemed a man to
We ended up breaking up with you. Can you repeat that last assertion, because it sounded like such a cliffhanger, so just the last thing that you were saying. So
Sure.
what you were saying in your the last.
Sure, where did you lose me at? Where did you lose me at?
I think you were talking about, it was just like a few seconds ago, so can you just go back to where you were just a few seconds ago?
So where did you lose me at? Sorry.
Oh, you were I think you were, someone had come, a man had come to your rescue.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So the other day, I was at night, I was in a dodgy part of town, and basically a guy who was definitely mentally ill made weird remarks on the street at me, and then right away a guy came to my rescue and made me veer him away and shoot him away. I would never receive that kind of social support, and that if I were a man. So my point was, us trans women kind of tread a line between having female privilege and having either male or female privilege when we're perceived as men by perpetrators, and then we get deemed to be at the bottom rung of the social hierarchy, being deemed less than human. I mean, when you look at the violence that trans women face in today's society, absolutely horrific. You really have to be deemed as less than human. You have to be deemed a man to receive that kind of violence. So that was my point. And then I continued on. So yeah, that's kind of where I come from. And then I also have another kind of controversial opinion that I take is that I kind of object to the kind of disdain the disdain with which we perceive the term man-up, because I actually, if used correctly, I don't think the term man-up is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, instead of ceasing to tell boys to man up, we should come up with a gender-neutral term that kind of captures the essence of that sentiment and employ it evenly and with good reason to both boys and girls. Because reminding a child that their feelings aren't always, each and every opportunity and circumstance, the center of the universe is actually a good thing. It avoids breeding a generation of narcissistic, self-obsessed, solipsistic, selfish, and unempathetic brides. But I think that might be too late. Sometimes emotions do need to be set aside to get shit done. And that's definitely an important thing to instill into our children, within good reason, of course. So yeah, that's where I come from. Other than that, yeah, that's kind of what I prepared. I don't have anything too formal. But yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Theron. So we'll start with zero sum. Ladies, first question: are we living in a zero sum mentality today when it comes to gender issues? Do we have a culture of black and white thinking, zero sum game thinking, when we venture into a culture of thought that in some women's circles, men often are the issues rather than men have issues, and that we are not all in this together? What do you think? Are we living in a zero-sum mentality on gender issues? So anybody can.
Can I ask you a question? What's zero sum mean? I don't know what that
think,
means.
Oh,
Zero sum is a game theory term, which means that total for all parties add up to zero, i.e. any gain by one party has to be an equivalent loss by the other. So the claim made here is that problem discussed is whether in what circumstances men's issues and women's issues are seen as complements between them.
thank you. Is that more clear? So I guess I'm just wondering, are there all women, if for social services, is it just, we only can think of helping people in terms of just women, or how can I put this? Is it just like black and white thinking when it comes to gender issues? Like services can be divided up only among men and women. Yes, Jeff? That might be a better way to put it. Are we living in a gender war? That it has to be either men or either women getting the help that they need?
I'll address that a little bit. I think oftentimes, at least this has been my experience, that a lot of the women's groups feel that if some of the issues pertaining to men are going to start being funded, that funding is going to be taken away from them. I think really that wouldn't be the objective. The objective is that there, regardless of your gender, there are issues, and services should be there. And I think we women can pat ourselves on the back for getting so much in place in the last 50 years. And men have just carried on and not taken the steps necessary to make sure that those services are there for them. I guess because they're too busy taking care of everything, or think they have to. So it's difficult for men to ask for help. That's been my experience. So that's part of the problem.
Right.
Well, what would strike me as interesting is what kind of interconnections are happening amongst the 70+% men that are dropping their children off at daycare when you're in your car. Because maybe there is this leavening going on, this interaction. One man seeing another man drop off a child, that means that they assume that there are some homemaking responsibilities. And then maybe there's dialogue going on amongst that network, right? Because it is a wondering thing about how a society changes and transforms over time. Obviously, our understandings of the 70s are
Surprisingly enough, the young men that come through our doors these days, the 20-year-olds, the 22-year-olds, the 24-year-olds, are shocked, thoroughly shocked at the inequality that's perpetrated on them because they're a father versus a man who might be 45 or 50. There's a huge difference in their expectations. So, you know, on the one hand, you'd think maybe they would step up and do something. I've always said, I think the only way this will change is women will change it.
Well, my son, just tag on briefly, my son is going through kind of an abusive situation, and he's taking custody of my granddaughter through that. But he's had no rapport with me. He's always telling me almost after the fact, as opposed to sharing or asking, because I also got custody of my firstborn son and raised him for 3 years on my own. But he's managing on his own and showing no vulnerability, or he's finding social agency. He's not dialoguing about what he's enduring or going through this fighting.
Darren, you had a thought there?
Yeah, sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing the audience of the people who have questions or comments. So there's that. But I wanted to say that if you look at the history of the gender roles, they've never been about competition. It's very unnatural. Like, gender roles have always been, you know, complementarianism and male-female cooperation. But we have seemed to have come to a point where it seems to be a bit of a gender war mentality. How we came here is kind of debatable. And I don't think it's a zero-sum game when it comes to raising awareness and getting people to think about these issues. I don't think the more we think about men's issues, the less we can think about women's issues. However, I feel like something like government funding is finite. It is kind of a zero-sum game in the sense that when we start actually giving like legitimate amounts of government funding to men's issues like domestic violence shelters, money will have to be compromised elsewhere, whether it be, you know, for women's issues, or whether it be for the environmentalist sector where government funding goes. And there will always be a special interest group lobbying against that. And that's a tough game. That is a very difficult battle to fight, is trying to get that kind of assistance.
Thoughts from the audience? Yes, I think I saw your hand.
I agree with Darren about the funding being fine, but to extend that to a more personal or social level, you often talk to somebody who is on, I guess you could say, the other side of this argument, it shouldn't seem that way. Their response, if you disagree with them, is, oh, you are denying experiences of women. So they say that if you hold a different opinion to them, that you're somehow invalidating their own. So they see it as a zero-sum game, even in that person's level. And I think that, at least the way I see it, comes from the academy, from academics, from sociology, from gender studies. That's a lot of the rhetoric comes from there.
So you think that part of the zero-sum mentality might be coming from the university themselves in teaching about gender issues?
Yes, and just the social justice communities. That's something that we really like to say.
Right, and that may perpetuate the feeling that if you do talk about men's issues, that you're also invalidating women's issues.
Yeah.
Okay. One other thought? Yes?
I was just going to point out that, both my majors are women, gender studies, and sociology, conveniently, right? But I think that you're right, we should talk a lot more about men's issues within our community. And although I just want to say that a lot of us do try, a lot of the readers do, not only masculinity, but racialized masculinity, we focus
often found is it doesn't matter if the victim is male or female. It's whichever service, if we make it a zero-sum game and we make it only about men or women, whichever service they go to first, that victimization will be recognized. But the other victimization will kind of hide it off. And I think that creates some really ugly dynamics. One of the things I think is really a positive movement, but it needs to go further in the state of Texas, puts mothers on the sex offender registry for not protecting their children if they know about it. We need to get to the point where that comes full circle, where fathers are put on the sex offender registry where if the mothers are still abusing. And I think when we keep it to male and female, we miss.
Okay, so we're back. Before the break, we discussed a couple of areas. First, the zero-sum outlook that we see when addressing gender issues, men's issues, women's issues. And we're pleased to have Theron Mayer from Vancouver on our panel tonight, online. Now that we've got her back, we were afraid that we might have lost that connection, but it's good now, right there, and you can hear us.
Can you guys hear me?
Great, perfect, excellent. Now we want to get to the other men's issues areas, and there's a vast range of men's issues to talk about. Gender bias law, crime and punishment, the lack of dedicated social services, homelessness, education, among others. But we probably won't be able to discuss them all in one evening. But seeing as how we have women on the panel here tonight supporting men as part of the Center for Men and Families in Toronto, or at the Canadian Association for Equality in focused men's issues areas, we're going to try narrowing it down to domestic violence, mental health, and fatherlessness. Once again, we have from your left to right, Yola Masani, Karen Glenn, Theron Mayer on screen, Ellen Campbell, and Heidi Neighbor. So let's start with mental health, because this still happens to coincide with an upcoming billboard campaign that I believe is expected later this spring or summer from the Canadian Association for Equality, our sponsor tonight, and the same organization known for the two other ad campaigns in the city on men's issues that we've seen so far. Their billboard on domestic violence came out about 1 year ago now, and their billboards on fatherlessness, those came out this past November. And the other reason I want to start with mental health is because it seems to tie in closely with the other men's issues areas of domestic violence and fatherlessness that we're discussing afterwards. This time I'm coming to you, Ellen, CEO of the Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness, because in your work, you're dealing with the mainstream public and perhaps with more often female clients. So my question is, how is it that today, when men are 3 to 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women are, that we still really see mental health services as more of a woman's thing, or are things changing? Certainly there is the first social services center dedicated to men and families now in Toronto, widely needed across Canada, but not widely known about. That's the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. Other than this initiative, and seeing how men are in dire mental health straits, in your view, what's happening in mental health for men today?
Well, I think Heidi made a good point, is I think there's a real concern. I work on a lot of women's committees, and I believe there is a real concern that the money is drying up and cutting back all the time as it is. So I think the real fear, there is definitely a fear that the money's going to, be used up even more, less money for the women. And I don't think our government is seeing, if you look at just our local Ontario MPPs, I think you have to do some real lobbying with our local MPPs. I heard tonight some ideas of what's happening with the budget, but I didn't really hear anything that is going to help men. Maybe it's free university for anybody that earns under $50,000 a year. I guess that might help boys and girls. But I really think there is a lack of awareness. And until, again, as Heidi said, the women really shouted the loudest, really. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. And I think the men, it can't just be the women coming forward for men. Like, here we are. But I think the men have to come forward for men and have a voice, just like the Men's Center is doing. So I think it's wonderful that you're doing this, and your organization is really spearheading it as well. That I think there's got to be a real groundswell with men. And I think men now are feeling, let's face it, it's shame that keeps men from calling. It keeps us all bound in our recovery process before we get into it. So I think the shame is coming off because of people coming forward like Sheldon Kennedy and Martin. So I think I would love to see men really, become a voice, become their own voice here. And the women will help. Like, we're happy to help, but I think the men have to be seen also as, I've had enough. I'm mad and doggone it, I've had enough. And really start to make a sound with our local MPPs for sure, and the media.
Eleanor, do you want to talk about your background?
Okay, hi.
Oh,
Hi, everybody.
after this question.
This is Miguel, and I am a social justice activist in Toronto.
Great.
I became a social justice activist because I was fairly treated by my employer, and in 2006, I used to work for the Toronto Zoo, and my story became news because I went to speak at City Hall about the abuses that I was going through. I was the tiny percent of men coming from a background of macho culture, that Latin culture, we are supposed to man up to. But in my case, the stress, the level of stress was so much on me, affecting my life. I couldn't act like a real father to my children. Because in the case, mine was a women supervisor was abusing me, psychologically and mentally abusing me. When I went over to my employer and talked about these issues, they basically didn't laugh in my face. And ever since, I have been the voice of my issues. I always talk about this matter. I know that people may laugh, but I don't care. I have a son who I want to see him grow in a society that's fair and equal for everybody. That his case will not be laughed at and say, oh yes, you're a man, you can take it. No, it's not about that, because the anxiety and the mental health that I suffer now because I have PTSD was a result of that experience at work. And I used to have a good job at the zoo, at the Toronto Zoo. My union threw me under the bus. The labor laws, they were not strong enough. And it affected me. And now I'm coming back.
Good.
Yeah, after so many years of suffering and pain. So
You're very brave to stand up.
Yeah.
And I think you'll get a lot more support now than you would have then.
Yes.
Because the men are starting to, as I say, men are starting to come forward now. And also, too, there's new legislation that came in a few years ago about harassment in the workplace. It's very different now. She couldn't get away with it the way she did then. There's a lot more support. Unfortunately, it happened after.
I wish I could have a lawyer and review the case at a federal court to take this matter again.
I have a really good lawyer, by the way, that works on contingency, that if you think you've got a good case, I'll put you in touch with
Because
you.
I want to help, so if my case gets to the federal court, I can make sure the other man gets through justice.
Speak to her afterwards. I'll give you her name.
All right.
She's works on these sorts of things, and she'll tell you if you have a case, and she won't charge you anything for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good for you. That's just what I'm talking about. That.
All right.
Eleanor?
My name is Eleanor, and
Oh, do you want us to
I was told
maybe
to come up.
yeah, maybe it's better.
My name is Eleanor, and I'm a psychiatric social worker. I work at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Social Work with master's degree students. I also have a private practice. I'm an advisor at the Men's Center, but I also work 2 afternoons a month, and I see men at the Men's Center. One of the men I saw 2 days ago told me that when he was a child, he was abused, physically abused, violently and constantly. And I asked who had done it, and he said it had been his mother. My first assumption was, like most of us would, usually you think it's the father, which is of course gender bias, and we all fall into it. But for him, it was his mother. I'm going to tell you a personal story of gender bias. When my husband and I travel, we take great pride. We always carry just a carry-on, no matter how far we go, no matter for how long. So if we buy gifts, we have to buy very small gifts. Last year we bought very small. We went to Montreal where I have 4 of my grandchildren, and I had bought bracelets for the 3 girls. And one of my grandchildren call me Bubby. And one of my granddaughters took the bracelet and she said, "Bubby, I hate bracelets." And her brother Jack said, "Can I have it?" And he put it on his wrist immediately. I mean, there he was, and he loved the bracelet, and his sister Madeline hated the bracelet. But it's this gender bias that I find very difficult. When I tell people that I'm involved with the Men's Center, they immediately say, "Oh, sexual abuse, deadbeat dads, anger management." That's their assumption immediately. The other thing that happens is when I tell people that I'm involved, they look at me as if I've lost it. You know, we always thought you were intelligent, you're well educated. Are you naive? You don't understand. It's men who are the perpetrators, women are the victims. And of course, I think instead of saying women are victims, we should call them the accusers, because sometimes women are victims, and very often, of course, men are victims, and we know that from the numbers. But I think that instead, before we call a woman a victim, we should call her an accuser, and then when there's due process of the law, then we can rename that. I object, as we all talk about, the bias of the law. I'm very involved with a number of people who have experienced parental alienation, and we know that the police and the law, the judges are very much on the side of the women. So I'm very proud to be involved, and I do counseling, as I say, 2 afternoons a month, and you know, I invite all of you to get involved, because thank you, Denise, thank you, Justin, we do really important, thank you, our board, we do very good work and important work. So that's how I
So Eleanor does counseling at the Canadian Centre for Men and Families twice a week. And what's that?
Twice a month.
Twice a month.
We would
Sorry
love
about
to have
that.
her twice a
We
week.
would love to have her twice a week.
Can I just correct something that Eleanor said? No disrespect to you, but if you look at the statistics on parental alienation, it's pretty much right down the middle between the perpetrators are both men and women, not just men. It is an equal split.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on quickly to domestic violence. And so last year, with the famous first ever citywide domestic abuse awareness billboard campaign produced by the Canadian Association for Equality, we learned that nearly half of all domestic abuse victims are in fact male. That's drawn from Stats Canada's 5-year general social survey from 2005 to 2009 of men and women during this period. In response, Leah McLaren writes in a Globe and Mail column that men's rights advocates are distorting the facts. Can I have your thoughts, panel, audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yola.
can touch a bit on that, because with regards to domestic violence, I actually recall the case of a dear friend of mine, and her partner at the time, they were caught in this violent dispute where there was shouting and screaming, and obviously the neighbors heard, and they called 911, and 911 responded. And now, as soon as the police arrived on scene, they knocked down their door. They like shouted first. They knocked down the door. They entered the room. They saw a messy room. They were both like, they looked like, you know, kind of like messed up and whatever. And they ran, grabbed the guy, okay, and shoved him on the floor. And they're like proceeding to arrest him and like reading him his rights. And she's just like standing there. And she's like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? Let him go. And the police, like, the way she described to me was like they just kind of came awake like, whoa, yeah, and they're like, yeah, ma'am, like, are you okay? You're okay now, like, you're fine. And she's like, what do you, like, this, you don't even know what's happened. And she's like, he didn't hit me, I hit him. And then, obviously they were like, and then they're like, ma'am, you're under arrest now, and they proceeded to arrest her as well. And let me tell you, they did not actually release her partner. He went to the police station as well. Regardless, the case continued down the road, and he was, you know, released, and he received pardon and whatever, I mean, due process. But what my point here is that, you know, there's a lot of discretionary power when it comes to the police, when it comes to the issue of domestic violence. They have so much power to determine the cases that they're evaluating, and because of these stereotypes that men are the perpetrators in domestic violence cases, they tend to, you know, carry those assumptions to the workplace. So when they visit these incidents, they don't stop to evaluate the situation fairly and give the victim the right to be protected, but rather they sometimes, even if the male is a victim, he's treated unfairly, unjustly, and inhumanely. So I think that it has a lot to do with the stereotypes. We have to start with the stereotypes, because if we don't shatter these myths, then they're going to perpetually show themselves in the justice system and in.
If I can jump in, we've had clients who were bloodied and were still arrested, and their wives had the knife in their hand. I mean,
I can't.
Yeah, and you know, I'll share a personal story, which I actually presented before Parliament when the Joint House Senate Committee convened back in, I think it was 97, and eventually came out with the report For the Sake of the Children, which has been shelved ever since then. That aside, I was going through a divorce, or about to leave my husband, my first husband. We had no children, and I got 30 minutes free with a lawyer through the Law Society, and said, you know, I want to get a divorce. I'm unhappy in my marriage, and all we had were property. That was it. A couple of cars, a house. And he said to me, you know, why are you, I wanted to know if I leave, this is how little I knew back then, this is a long time ago. I thought, if I leave, do I lose my right to my equity in the home? And so I really didn't know my rights at all. And he said to me, instead of answering that question, he said, well, why do you want to leave? I said, because I'm unhappy, my husband won't go into marriage counseling, I'm done, I'm ready to move on. He said, you don't have to leave. Get him to hit you, or make it look like he did, and we'll get you exclusive possession of the house, spousal support, and he'll be forcibly removed. All in one sentence. Now I'm in a fog because I'm in an unhappy marriage, and it kind of went over my head, and it was like, well, my husband's never raised a hand to me, and I would never do that to him. But I often bring this up because, you know, we women have so much power because of the zero tolerance mandate. And I have to say, Kathleen Wynn's not really helping in that department, because she's saying that 99% of all domestic violence is perpetrated by men, which I don't know what statistics she's basing that on. All that aside, you know, you throw in the scenario I just described, if there were children involved, and I just found out that my husband had an affair. What a great way to get back at him. But what a great way to screw up some kids as they see their father being, taken out. And unfortunately, we see so many of these, what I call false allegations, so that you get the upper hand in family court. It's all tied in together to get, because once you're in criminal court, once you've got a criminal proceeding going on, there's going to be a restraining order in place, blah, blah, blah. I'm probably going off topic here, but
Can continue.
I mean, it still pertains to domestic violence. The point being, they're all intertwined, and it's all a big industry. And unfortunately, within that industry, children are often lost in the mix.
So
I
think I'm just
you asked where she got the source from. I know the answer because I asked her office for that.
So this is the
information.
source.
The source.
For the 99%
that Kathleen would use for that 95%.
99%.
99%
right.
of people.
So this is the Who Will You Help campaign that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the thrust of the campaign was exclusively on men as perpetrators or aggressors of domestic violence and sexual abuse against women. And the claim was that, well, the branding was exclusively men against women. So we at Canadian Association for Equality asked the Premier's office why that was the exclusive focus, and the response was there's overwhelming evidence that 99% of cases involve men assaulting women. So we asked for a couple of examples of the overwhelming evidence. And after 2 or 3 months of going through multiple offices and departments, we finally got a response. The overwhelming evidence came down to one study. The study was looking only at violence against women. And out of that, 99%, I mean it was 95% or something like that, was committed by men. But they took it as a given that there was no such thing as violence against men, I guess, because the study was exclusively focused on violence against women. And then out of that, yes, most violence against women is committed by men. Although I think we've done more research now on same-sex violence and same-sex relationships, so that might have changed. But the point is, the study didn't even look at violence against men. And I followed up and I pointed this out. I even contacted the agency that put the statistic together to make sure I was interpreting it correctly, and they confirmed that I was. And so I pointed this out to the Premier's office, and I asked if they had any other evidence, because remember, she said that there's overwhelming evidence, and they have not responded to that request yet.
Because it's only one study.
It's one study that does not at all back up their claim.
This is no different than that one study in the U.S., and I can't remember this woman's name, who said that women after divorce have a lower amount of money to survive on. I can't think of the word right now. Brain not working. Lower standard of living after divorce than men. That's not my experience. It's the reverse. And in fact, her study was disputed multiple times, and yet that's still the standard in the United States, which is kind of shocking.
So much to talk about. We could talk about this all night, but we're going to move on to fatherlessness, which will be the last topic of the evening. And I just lost where I was. But Heidi, this is your specialty, your area, because
I've been
an
talking
activist.
way too much.
But I am going to come to you because you are the specialist on father's rights.
Well, let me correct you. I'm actually a specialist on the rights of children to have their fathers in their life. Because fathers' rights, unfortunately, right now, is as bad as the N-word. And I don't want to be associated with that. I want people to understand that children have a right to the parenting that they're entitled to. So if I can correct you that way.
Okay, so
the rights of children.
The rights of children.
To have their father in their life.
And
I'll make it easy on it. You can say father's rights, just for short.
Okay. So yeah, as co-founder of Fathers Resources International, can you tell us what's most at stake for fathers today?
Oh my God, the list is endless. poverty, suicide. I can't tell you how many fathers have cried in my office. They miss their children. Their children miss them. You know, the unfortunate side of all this is that it always comes down to money. The way our legislation is written, if you can maintain access under 40%, you still pay full child support. And, you know, I'm not here to say that child support isn't necessary. It is. But the epidemic of fatherlessness and what that translates into, I don't know if you still have those statistics that I emailed you, because I can't think of them off the top of my head, but you know, girls are just astronomically more likely to get pregnant before the age of majority. Their self-esteem is in the basement or sub-basement. They typically will have either some sort of body issues, whether it's anorexia or the other one that I can't think of right now. Bulimia. And they typically will engage in sexual activity at a much earlier age. The father is there to teach them that giving of themselves to a male, if that's their choice, or female, in a sexual way, is something that you really have to think about. It's not something that you just give away because that's what everybody's doing in school. Ironically, my stepdaughter, who had my husband, her father, in her life from 0 to 13, was the one female in all of her female friends who had a child by choice at age 29. Some of her friends have children that are 13 years old today. So some of her friends started having kids at age 16. All of those girls grew up in fatherless homes. That's kind of shocking to me. On the other hand, for boys, men, your job is to teach your son how to be a man and what that means. Women can't do that. That's not our job. We don't know what it is to be a man. We just know what it is to be a woman. And I think the degree of violence would lower. I think the fact that, you know, so many young boys are put on Ritalin because they are being disruptive. I think sometimes that's just the lack of having a father in their life, and they're running around and doing things. Testosterone has a lot to do with a higher energy level that you need to get out of your system. Instead, we're, you know, medicating half the population so that they're compliant. Oddly enough, there was an interesting study this week that came to light that if kids are physically active during class, they actually do better. I'd like to see that. I'm going to predict that the amount of Ritalin that's being prescribed or similar stimulants for ADD and ADHD are going to come down if that becomes the norm in school. So here's some of the other statistics that pertain to fatherlessness. Children have a higher degree of, or higher incident of suicide, drug abuse, and become incarcerated more frequently. That's more so for boys than girls. I'd be curious to know if that 14-year-old girl that just stabbed 9 people this week in school has a father in her house. I would predict no. So I think we are forgetting what the tremendously important contribution men and fathers bring to our children in becoming good citizens.
And we have a thought from Paulette on this very issue to continue those remarks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking around tonight. I know it's getting late, so I'll keep this short and sweet. My name is Paulette McDonald, and I'm a family justice advocate. I'm proud to say I'm on the board of directors with CAFE. I'm a proud member of an international organization called Leading Women for Shared Parenting. I also do some volunteer work for Parental Alienation Awareness Organization. Pardon me. And all that came to be after witnessing both sides of divorce in Canada. My own divorce, without government involvement, in which my ex-husband remarried a wonderful woman who loved and nurtured my children right from the get-go. They were only 3 and 4 years old at the time. I loved her for loving them, and life went on. They're now 35 and 36, and I'm proud to say I have 6 beautiful grandbabies as a result. I thought that's how all parents divorced, but I was wrong. It wasn't until 2005 when I met and fell in love with a non-custodial dad and his 2 young children, with living a nightmare with government involvement in his divorce. And prior to meeting him and his children, had someone said to me, I haven't seen my children in 6 months since the divorce. My first reaction would have been, my God, what did you do? You must have done something wrong. I wouldn't have believed for one moment that his children were deliberately alienated from him, or that our government intervened and alienated his children from him. I just never would have believed that our government would do that. Our existing family law system is so outdated and profoundly broken, it's not acting in the best interest of our children. It's acting in the best interest of our government's pocketbook. Mm-hmm. And that's a fact.
That's good.
It really is, and it's a real shame. And the saddest part is that our family law system was originally put in place to help parents when they are most vulnerable, when they're going through divorce or separation. And instead of helping these families when they are most vulnerable, what they are doing is pitting them against one another with its winner-take-all approach to family law. The children are being used as weapons and pawns, and they are suffering the consequences because of it. I'll give you a quick example. There's a mom and dad who worked shift work. While dad was on days, he took care of the children in the evening, and mom took care of the children at night. Or when she was on days, she took care of them at night. When they separated, he just assumed that they would continue with that schedule, that when he was on days, he would have the kids for the week, and when she was on days, she would have the children. Well, he was wrong. Mom decided she wanted sole custody, and for no other reason than to get back at dad. So dad had to go to court on several occasions, and ultimately he did win, and he got to have his children on the week-about basis. But that wasn't before he spent his life savings doing so. And again, that's a shame. That's not how it should be. I can provide you with several other examples, but Denise has warned me I only have like 3 minutes, so I'm going to keep it real short. We recently had an equal parenting bill, C-560, and of course our bill was defeated. Our biggest opposition was the Canadian Bar Association. Go figure. They have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Had we achieved a rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting at the onset of divorce or separation in the absence of abuse, neglect, or abandonment, our family law lawyers and judges would lose 2/3 of their income. So of course, they opposed our bill. And given that the bulk of our parliamentarians are lawyers or former judges, of course they opposed our bill as well. But we haven't given up. We continue to fight. And while we have made some progress in the family law field, we have a long way to go. Our children need and deserve to be loved by both mom and dad, especially after separation and divorce. So I'm asking you all to help us end the suffering of our children. Let's not force them to choose to love just one of their parents and just half of their extended family members. So help us make shared parenting a reality, because the best child support is equal shared parenting. Thank you for listening.
One statistic that's of great interest, when you look at the amount of money in the legal profession, the greatest amount of revenue in all the different categories. There's criminal, there's corporate, there's real estate. The largest amount of money that's earned is in family law. That's a fact. So you can see that there is an enormous vested interest in keeping people fighting. So your cause has a huge hurdle to get over.
Oh, I know.
If I just add to that too, I had this similar experience. I went before the Senate Committee on minimum sentencing, and the people that opposed it was the Canadian Bar Association. Because minimum sentencing means it's automatic. They don't get to drag it out. Luckily, our government at that time brought in minimum sentencing.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Paulette. That, I'm afraid, is really all the time that we have. We have actually gone over time. Do you have one more thought?
One question. As of one of the things we need to know is, why would they oppose a shared parenting bill? What is the reasons given for the government shutting down the shared parenting bill?
The Canadian Bar Association, one of their biggest reasons for opposing our bill was them stating that our bill put the parents' rights before the children's rights, when in fact it's just the opposite. Right now, our existing system puts the parents' rights before the children's rights. And it's whichever parent can be the biggest fighter is the one who's going to win that battle. What we're saying is take the parents out of the equation and permit the children to have access to both of their parents, unless there is a case of abuse, neglect, or abandonment.
Isn't the law written in such a way that the children's best interest is supposed to be put forth ahead of everything else?
I'm sorry?
The child's best interest is what's written in law ahead of the parents, and that's apparently what they say that they're doing. Is they're doing this in the child's best interest. How is this,
The term in the best interest of the children has been in our legislation pretty much right from the get-go. The problem with that is that none of our legislation truly clarifies what the best interest of the child truly is. And it's up to the discretion of the judge to determine what the best interest of that particular child is. And I'll tell you, if you have a judge that is biased or a judge that is outdated and believes that in the old school where mom should be the primary caregiver and dad should be the every other weekend visitor, then that's in the best interest of the child according to that particular judge.
Thank you.
Can I add one more thing?
Very quickly.
Very quickly.
In answer to what you're just saying, think about what it takes to become a judge. When you go through law school, then you have to article. In order to become a partner in a law firm, you have to work 60, 80 hours a week. Once you become a partner, then you have to write a text. Often that will, leapfrog you into the judge position. The point being, probably the worst parents are sitting as judges. They weren't there. They have no concept of what it is to be a parent. I can tell you, probably the majority of them see their kids every other weekend, when they're not playing golf. Okay, and that's something that the government needs to take into account, is that they need to understand that their own judgments and their own perspective on what family is counter to what the majority of Canadians is.
Thank you. That's all the time that we have. I'd like to thank our panelists tonight. I'm so pleased. So Yola, Karen, Ellen, Heidi, Theron, thank you for sharing your thoughts tonight with us, and a big thank you to our audience for joining us in the discussion. I'm Denise Fong, your host on behalf of the UT Men's Issues Awareness Society. If you enjoyed tonight's event, I would encourage you to support our work and sign up for event updates. Come back next month. We hold our events monthly and are supported only by the generosity of individuals such as yourselves. So please donate what you can to help us keep bringing men's issues on campus. And just a word in for our next event, I'll tell you right now, it's replacing Miss Andrew with Catherine Young and Paul Nathanson. So they'll be coming in next month to the UT. Thank you and good night. Thank you.